Okay, so my first question is so what are the various economic models that are out there right now?
Historically, conventionally, or traditionally, there have been two basic systems of economic models. One is the capitalistic model,
Uh-huh.
the other one is the communistic model, a socialistic model. But of late, the distinction between the two are becoming somewhat less sharp. So there's no such thing as a legitimate capitalistic model or a legitimate socialistic model as a whole. Now, so we can generally talk now about a left-wing model or a right-wing model. Right-wing model is one which places stress on individual contributions to economic decision making in society,
Hmm.
while while a left-wing model lays stress on community decision making, decisions made by a collegium of people.
Okay.
Uh, that's what one can think of at this stage in terms of economic systems in the world. Yes.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about how they are distributed? For example, in what regions of the world um, has the left-wing model and what regions of the world have the right-wing model?
The new world, I'm talking of the Americas, have traditionally followed the right wing model. In some cases, extreme right wing models. For example, in South America, they're rather extreme. In North America, not so extreme. While the Eastern Europe, at least over the last 100 years, has followed a left wing model. And East Asia, China, and Southeast Asia have followed even more left wing models. Somewhat, for example, Cambodia for a while claimed to be following the communistic model, an idealistic communistic model. So yes, generally speaking, the new world has followed the right wing model. The parts of the old world have followed a left wing model. Even Europe has generally followed a very socialistic model.
Okay.
Probably not as socialistic as Eastern Europe, but definitely socialistic. Much more than, let's say, the New World, United States, Canada, and so on.
Okay. So when we talk about left-wing models, the names that come to mind are socialism and communism. So what's the
Yes.
difference between the two of them?
Communism is a more extended version of socialism. Communism is a dictatorship of the proletariat, while socialism does not go that far. It has room for certain capitalist practices.
Okay.
But still, the basic theme still remains the same, which is public control of economic decision making. That is probably true of more communism as well as capitalism. But the only thing in the communistic system of economic decision making, it's concentrated in a few, and dissent vis-a-vis those decision makings are not really favored. Unlike socialism, which still follows a significant amount of democratic principles.
Okay. So because communism is more extreme, is that the reason why it did not fare as well as, let's say, socialism?
One could say so, but I think the basic reason why communism failed is because there was no input of fresh ideas. Democratic decision making, one great advantage of democratic decision making is that it receives, if not accept, fresh ideas from outside, while communism never did.
Hmm.
And so economically it was extremely dysfunctional. And I think it was only a matter of time before it failed and it collapsed, and that's what happened in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Okay. Next, can we talk a little bit about the factors that contributed to the rise and subsequent fall of certain models? Like if we
I
start with
think
capitalism.
historical forces. Look at the way the new world was formed. United States. They were actually immigrants from Europe
Mm,
who felt constrained by the system in the old world, and they wanted to create a new world where they would have total freedom. And this included economic freedom as well, as much as religious and political freedoms. So that was the history behind the immigration to the new world. Now,
mm,
when it comes to the East, the old world,
mm,
Eastern part, obviously they have been much longer. They have had much longer experience with
mm.
government, with public decision making, with society, much longer. America, after all, has had just about 300, 400 years of history, while old world obviously had much longer periods of history. So I think the history and historical experience has been one important factor.
Mm.
America has not had that long history. Now, what's happening now? Here, socialistic principles, I think, could be beginning to take hold in America,
Mm.
just as it retreated in Europe in the mid to late 19th century.
Mm.
So, yes, I think it's basically a historic experience.
Mm.
Historic as regards the practice and failures and successes of the economic systems. That explains virtually the reasons why socialist systems prevail in certain parts of the world, and communist and the right wing systems are in certain other parts.
Okay. Now, one basic question I have is, for most of the history of the world, what was the economic model that people were following?
I would rather say we are different variants of the right wing system.
Uh-huh.
Communist model, as a rule, power was initiated way back, probably at the times of Plato, Aristotle, and so on. They were, and if at all they were practiced, it was an extremely small scale. The first large-scale practice of extreme left-wing model was probably in Russia, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was formed in about 1918, 1919, thereabouts.
Mm.
And of course, later on in China, 30 years later, back in the late 1940s. But yes, left-wing models have relatively short history. But I think the world has followed right-wing model of
Mm.
various kinds over the last millennia or so.
Okay. Okay. So, did the rise of left-wing models, what contributed to their rise, basically? Was it personalities of people who promoted them or something else?
Various reasons. Personality always contributed. For example, the philosophy underlying left-wing economic models were clearly laid down by Karl Marx. That was in the mid 19th century.
Hmm.
And another thing is, I think one of the, almost in the historical experience, I said, over the last 200 or 300 years, and there is a certain amount of intellectual revolution that also contributed.
Hmm.
The industrial revolution itself contributed.
Hmm.
People could see that there were certain exploitative features of the right-wing system or the capitalist system which needed to be set right.
Hmm.
And accordingly, left-wing economic system, I think, had their field day in the first half of the 20th century,
Hmm.
probably more than any other period in life. And that also partly a consequence of the First World War and
Hmm.
the Great Depression and so on. Yes,
Hmm.
people's historical experience, particularly economic experiences, experience of experience of exploitation and so on, certain amount of trauma arising out of the war, all these also contributed to the rise of left-wing economic systems, and long periods of peace somehow
Hmm.
have tended to desensitize people to these things, and then one veers away from left-wing the economic system and moves on to the right wing ones, as it has been happening over the last 20 or 30 years.
Okay.
And America, for example, recently had a checkered economic history. And then
Okay.
again, here again, the left wing economic systems are being attended to. People are paying attention to what it says and they're really looking to that.
Right. So you're obviously referring to the Occupy Wall Street movement that's
Right.
happening.
Yes, yes, yes. And there are many people describing as the first pangs of the rise of socialism in the United States.
Hmm.
Time to tell.
Okay. So your the takeaway point is periods of turmoil leads
Yes.
to left-wing adoption.
Exactly. I think yes. A turmoil serves as the basis for
Okay.
resort to left-wing economic policies.
Okay. And if there's a popular figure who can rally the masses during
That'd be
that
even
time,
better. That'd
it'll
be
be
even
even
better.
better.
Even in the Soviet Union back in the early 20th century, Lenin,
Hmm.
man was in power really not for very long, just about 3 years. Fortunately, it was a good fortune, if I may say so, of the Soviet Union and of the left-wing movement, that Lenin was around, a good leader. If Lenin had not been there, I think people's urge for a left-wing orientation economic policies would not have found their fulfillment at all. I don't think so.
Hmm.
History is replete with instances where the lack of leadership has led to the failure of movements.
Hmm.
Yes, leadership is very important. Leadership is very important in all human movements. Yes,
Okay.
more
Now,
so in something more so dramatic as economic movements.
okay. Now, why are people so they identify a lot with their favorite economic model? Why is it like that? Why are people so obsessed with what they like and what they dislike?
Sense of security, great sense of self-interest. For example, in the Soviet Union before it collapsed, according to the poll findings coming out of late, people are now looking back with nostalgia to the days of the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
Those were the days may not be of great material affluence, but definitely of a sense of security.
Hmm.
Left-wing economics generally assure a certain amount of social security.
Yes.
Right-wing does not.
Right.
Right wing says right wing says either you're creative and you take part, you contribute. If you're not able to do any of these, you just perish.
Right.
I think that could really put out a large section of the people. I think it's essentially a sense of security.
But even right wing, for example, a lot of people in America, they
Yes.
they just hate any talk about socialism or communism, or at least they used to in the middle of last century. So,
I'm
what's the
not
reason
sure
for
whether it is
that?
an account of understanding the right wing political ideology and the left wing political ideology. I don't think so. I think it's largely because of the certain amount of the indoctrination that has gone on for decades against left wing economic policies, at least as far as the United States is concerned. I think that is the reason. And of course, the failure of socialism, the failure of communism, I wouldn't say socialism, but the failure of
Hmm.
communism in Eastern Europe probably has fed their predilections. But I think essentially a certain element of unthinking and indoctrination is also responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Objectively speaking, yes, socialist communism did not deliver, but socialism has delivered.
Mm.
For example, in Northern Europe, Sweden has never been a capitalistic country. It's always been a socialist country to any extent. Same argument holds good for Germany. Same argument holds good for France. And they are not particularly poor. They are almost as rich as the United States. So
Mm.
for the Americans to claim that
Mm.
right-wing economics will hold the key to material prosperity probably is a bit of an exaggeration.
Okay. Okay, which brings me to the next question, which is, in your opinion, what are the pluses and minuses of either model?
Historically, it's very difficult to answer this question because historically, left-wing or let's say more particularly communistic economic system hasn't really existed for too long. It existed in the Soviet Union for about 70 years. That's
Hmm.
about all.
Okay.
And while the right-wing systems have existed for much longer period of time. Now, pros and cons, it appears that from an economic point of view, the uh, the right-wing systems have proved to be somewhat more successful
Mm.
in terms of growth rates,
Mm.
while left-wing has not. That's number one. Number two is that in terms of distribution of affluence, the distribution of wealth, it looks like the right wing models have much to answer, unlike the left wing models. Now, I'm particularly comparing, say, Western Europe, Central Europe, and America.
Mm.
While it appears to me that the Europeans have made a slightly greater success of the economic systems than the Americans have, as is clear now. It's becoming increasingly clear now. And the left wing and American and the Europeans have generally followed a left wing economic model. So I think one should not be obsessed with the extremist philosophies of left-wing model or right-wing model. One must look at a judicious combination of good elements of both.
Okay.
And
Okay.
that's here is probably where the extreme right wing in America is probably making a mistake,
Mm.
just as the extreme left wing in Europe made a mistake.
Right. So you're saying neither extreme is good. There should be what do you say,
That's
elements of both models.
exactly. I would rather say so. I'd rather say so. You've got to strike at a golden mean. Obviously, it's much easier said than done. How exactly it's accomplished is
Hmm.
again a factor of the evolution of a particular society. Its evolution, its homogeneity, its traditions, its economic traditions, religious traditions, social traditions, and so on. It becomes rather more complex. Yes, it's not that easily accomplished.
Okay.
But
So
one just hankers for it, that one could accomplish it, whereby you have the best of both worlds. And I think your Occupy Wall Street movement is essentially a reference to that. That's why it might sound often confusing a little off and on,
hmm.
but I think that's the nature of the movement, whereby you sort of seek to have the best of both worlds.
Okay. Okay, so looks like what you're saying is, if I can just quickly summarize this, left-wing
Yes.
models are good for the security of the society.
It's a sense of
Everybody,
security.
yeah, social
People
say
feel
everybody
secure
gets taken
because it
care
seems
of,
to take care of all sections of the people.
right? And
While
right wing,
the right wing is extremely explicit about it. If you say if you don't contribute, you don't have anything to contribute. Well, I have to leave you on the sidelines.
right? It's yeah, okay. So it's a survival of the fittest kind of a thing.
In some sense, yes.
Okay, would you say that the right wing models contribute more to innovation and creativity?
Oh yes, it has. It definitely has. It absolutely has. I think the history of the United States vis-a-vis the history of Soviet Union is a very good example of that. Yes, you're absolutely
Okay,
right.
okay.
When
So
it comes to
okay,
even China, I think. Well, the point is that China never really contributed any innovation in any field.
okay.
The thing is that it did succeed in pulling millions of people from under the poverty line to something substantially above that.
Hmm.
That's a complex matter again. How come China has been such an economic success while the Soviet Union was not? Again, this is a complex question.
Hmm.
China became an economic success essentially because it veered away from the socialist system and copied many aspects of the capitalistic system, particularly since the late 1970s.
Hmm.
So I think it only adds strength to our earlier point that the left wing system is good in certain parts, and the
Hmm.
right wing system is good in certain other parts, and how you mix them, and that holds the key to an overall good condition.
Okay.
I largely achieving it.
So can you expand a little bit about when you're saying China incorporated some elements of the Western system? So what
Yes.
exactly were they?
There are still lots of controls in China,
Uh,
and the controls are designed to ensure that everybody has a role to play. Everybody receives something from the state. The community as a whole is rather socialistic. It's approach to people and the people's problems. But in terms of economic management, they are following virtually the laissez-faire system as practiced by the United States. You
okay.
see, and that has led to tremendous explosive growth. And at the
Hmm.
same time, many people have been taken on. They have come on board. They
Hmm.
have not been left behind.
Hmm.
So I think, as far as the Chinese system is concerned, one does not know. It could be a combination of several factors. It could be a fortuitous development. There seems to have struck the right formula, at least in the medium term. One
Hmm.
does not know what's going to happen after 20, 30, 40 years, but over the last 30 years, I think things have seemed to be going well.
Okay. Would you say that the culture of, let's say, the country, for example, USSR versus China, also had a role to play?
Probably yes. Probably yes. Probably yes. China, of course, is a very much more homogeneous country. That
Hmm.
helps. China has a long history behind it.
Hmm.
That also helps. Now, as far as Soviet Union is concerned, I'm not very sure it was a failure of the heterogeneity. Soviet Union was not that heterogeneous as India is, for example. If you
Hmm.
look at the composition of the Soviet population, still about 50, I'm talking about USSR in
Hmm.
1989, still it was largely European, Russian.
Hmm.
The non-Russian, the non-European segment of USSR are still very small.
Hmm.
Uzbeks and Kazakhs and so on, they're essentially very small. So I think it was a failure of a system.
Hmm.
And this is where probably right wingers in America have a point. The system failed, the system collapsed. It very
Hmm.
much looks like the system was not tailored to last for long.
Hmm.
It failed because it was too idealistic, it was unrealistic in many ways, I think.
Hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Any other points that you wish to add to this?
Yes. Our discussion still now, as we talked about only the Europeans,
Hmm.
we have not made any reference, let's say, to Africans. We have not made any reference to Indians,
Hmm.
and not even to not even to the Japanese. The Chinese to some extent, but not even to the Japanese. Now, what about the Japanese experience? What about the Indian experience, African experience, and so on? That leads to many other questions to be asked. I think the permeation of ideas somehow many of these new intellectual ideas have emanated from Europe,
Hmm.
and one would suspect that Japan is too far away, and maybe India is also a bit far away, and Africa, and so they have really not been too much affected by this intellectual ferment, unlike Russia, unlike Eastern Europe.
Hmm.
So one may ask, what about Japan? What is good for India? What is good for Africa? I think we are going through a process of certain amount of evolution, at least as far as India is concerned. we are trying out both. We have tried out the socialistic pattern. We are now increasingly trying out the capitalistic pattern, and only time will tell which would succeed. Here again, the nature of the society comes into play. For example, you look at the way we practiced socialism in India back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. It very quickly became a uniquely Indian variety of socialism. It became what can generally be called a bureaucratic socialism, as distinct from the Japan is concerned. As far as Japan is
Mm.
concerned, Japan hasn't practiced socialism of any particularly leftist variety. To its varying degree, it has been social democratic, but
Mm.
not communistic as in China or or the Soviet Union. So I think, as I said earlier, the historic experience plays an important part.
Mm.
The rise of communism in Russia, in Eastern Europe, was probably a reaction to two things. One was the extremely harsh, exploitative regime of the Tsar,
Mm.
the kind of experience probably other countries did not go through. That's number one. Number two was the existence of a good, sound, imaginative leadership,
Mm.
Lenin. And the third one is the permeation of ideas coming from Western Europe, through the Karl Marx and others,
Mm.
Marx and Engels and so on. So I think these are the factors there, and these factors are not existing elsewhere.
Mm.
That's exactly why I think, at least we in this country, we are stumbling along. We didn't know what kind of model is good for us. We
Mm.
are trying out various models, and our character definitions are coming to the fore, as probably they did elsewhere also, but probably in India it's becoming more and more prominent thanks to the system of mass dissemination of information in this day and age, unlike
Mm.
100 years ago. And as far as Africa is concerned, it looks like it's virtually sealed off
Mm.
as far as the intellectual ferment is concerned from the rest of the world. Fortunately for them, numbers are not very large.
Mm.
But otherwise, one does not know what they're really going on. So various kinds of socialism have been adopted, have been jettisoned.
Mm.
Likewise, various kinds of rightist system is adopted, jettisoned, and they're just going along without much of external influence.
Okay.
So this is the way economic systems are going. But now, I think as we have entered the 21st century, as we progress in the 21st century, I think old paradigms,
Mm.
Marxist paradigms or anti-Marxist paradigms, I think they may not be relevant anymore. We are going to have various shades of economic system in which Marxist theses and anti-Marxist theses will have to coexist as
Okay.
some kind of amalgam of the two. I think that's the direction of the future.
Okay. So that's where you see the world heading.
That's where I see the world
Okay,
heading. That's
and then it'll have its own different flavor in different parts of
I,
the world.
I think so. I think so. I think so. It does look like Marxist philosophies. Well, in a historical sense, probably just had a call on economic decision making things in just for about 150 to 200 years, not much longer.
Okay.
But that's how humanity will evolves.
Right. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other points that you wish to make?
Um, Not now, but the role of technology. Actually, the point is the industrial revolution of the late
Uh,
19th century had an important role to play.
okay.
Now I think it's not industrial revolution, not even the industrial revolution of the internet and so on. I think it is people, number of people, the population, which
Mm.
is going to play a very, very important role in the future. This was not the case 150 years ago.
Okay.
So it's not industrial revolution, it is the people, and probably the information revolution.
Mm.
That's going to play a role in the evolution of economic systems in future, in the coming years.